Hello, it's Dr. Perry again. We're going to start discussing the two Platonic dialogues that we read in this class. So there's going to be a few things to keep in mind, but this is going to be your introduction to the Gorgias. What I want you to keep in mind, basically in the background of all of this, is that though Socrates is critiquing rhetoric all the time and criticizing rhetoricians, this class is called World of Rhetoric. So one of the things that we're going to have to figure out is, why are we starting with this? Why would we use these Platonic dialogues to introduce you to rhetoric when Socrates and Plato ostensibly are not big fans of rhetoric? Part of this is because it's a foundational conversation and place to start, and we see the repetitions of stasis theory within the conversations that take place when we read the Gorgias. So part of it is looking at the way that the questions are asked and then thinking about what kind of world we live in terms of a perfect world or an imperfect world. Also, I want to remind you that your first set of assignments, the New York Times, your individual instructors will talk to you a little bit more about these in terms of the framework of the assignment and the things that you're going to want to think about in terms of these assignments. You're going to create a Platonic framework. So as you read the Gorgias and the Phaedrus, think about what it means to make a framework. Your instructors will talk to you about this. There's also a couple of handouts in your book addressing this. So we'll think about that. This is more or less a reminder to start reading the New York Times. You have electronic access to the newspaper, so mix in with your daily dose of doom scrolling through the news. Start reading this particular outlet. So, first thing to think about when you read a Platonic dialogue. Reading text and analyzing text is a process. The first time that I read a Platonic dialogue, I was sitting in a bit class, much like yourself, at 18 years old, and I didn't really understand what I was reading. I have since been reading Platonic dialogues for the next 20 years, and in reading those dialogues, my understanding of what Socrates is trying to do has evolved each time. So I'm teaching this, I guess, for the 8th or 9th year in a row, and every time that I go back and I reread the Gorgias, I find something new. Every time I go back and I reread the Phaedrus, I find something new. So if on the first time through, you feel like you're not quite sure what you're supposed to be doing here, that's a perfectly natural part of the process. So you're going to want to think about that, think about the processes of reading and what it means to have evolving readings and being willing to change your interpretation as you move through the text. The question that I posed to you up front, can anything be truly and absolutely perfect? Plato has this idea of the forms, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But ostensibly that there's an essence to reality or an essence to things where those things can be perfect. There are perfect versions of things. If you think about what your perfect day would be, and you think about who you would spend that day with, the food you would eat, the types of things that you would do in terms of activities, the people around you in your class probably wouldn't agree on the same things. I know that the faculty wouldn't all agree on what their perfect day would be if they were going to go spend that day. So if you think about the Platonic form of something and the fact that Plato expects that Platonic form to be universal, that is, that everybody would have the same conception of it, then you begin to see where the difficulty in implementing the type of argumentation and the type of philosophy that Plato wants to do comes in, and why it would be so maybe frustrating to argue with somebody like Socrates. This is because if you think about rhetoric and what rhetoric is supposed to do, there's a key term called polysemy. Polysemy simply means that there are many different readings of the same text, right? So this past week, we celebrated the anniversary of the March on Washington. And a lot of people think about the March on Washington as a pivotal point in the civil rights movement, which it was, but it also, that memory comes with a presupposition about the way that Dr. King was received at the time. When in fact, Gallup polling shows that 74% of Americans, when the March on Washington was given, did not approve of the march itself and thought that mass demonstrations hurt the cause of civil rights. So there are always moving interpretations and multiple interpretations when we're doing rhetorical criticism. That's this sort of as many different people, as many different ways to read a text. That's the concept of polysemy. Ask yourself as you're reading through this whether Socrates' character that Plato has written really allows for this, and whether you think it is important to allow for this. So perfection is the expectation for Plato, and you'll see this. He's going to go through a series of conversations, first with Gorgias, then with Gorgias' students, and he's really going to push them on whether or not they know what rhetoric is, and whether or not they know what the perfect mode of teaching people is. Gorgias has a school in Athens. Socrates has a school in Athens. They're both teachers. Socrates and Plato, or Socrates' character, right, is going to be making some arguments about teaching and what the preferred method of teaching should be. So things to keep in mind here is, and I've already mentioned this, we don't necessarily live in a perfect world. We struggle with the absence of perfection. In fact, Kenneth Burke says that human beings are rotten with perfection. Whenever we try to do things perfectly, we often get in our own way. Or if we obsess over something being perfect, you've probably heard the turn of phrase, the perfect is the enemy of the good. Well, you're going to want to be aware of that. So we may feel like we have perfection in a given sense or in a given situation, but there's probably always something that wouldn't quite be perfect for the other people interpreting that situation. So rhetoric is an imperfect tool for an imperfect world. This is where Socrates has problems. He doesn't want to do rhetoric, he wants to do philosophy. Over the next couple of weeks, as we read these dialogues, one thing that is going to be recurrent are the themes of the true, the good, and the beautiful. If you get lost at any point in class discussion over the next couple of weeks, you could probably raise your hand and say the true, the good, and the beautiful in response to almost any question, and you're likely to be somewhere near the ballpark, in the ballpark of being correct. So the true, obviously, we're talking about whether something is correct. The good, for Socrates, is going to be, is it in service of a universal good? So not necessarily do we think something's good or do we enjoy it, but is it contributing to a capital G good? And then the beautiful. Do things sort of add up in a way that makes the universe align and us see the good and what is true? When Socrates says we see these things, then that is the beautiful. He's after something transcendent. I've left the picture portion of this slide blank, ostensibly because trying to conceptualize what the true, the good, and the beautiful would be is going to be really difficult, right? So if I shared a picture of almost anything, a piece of art, someone would have a critique, or it wouldn't be the kind of art that they like. If I shared a picture of beauty standards have changed over the generations. So this sort of transcendence that Socrates is searching for in the conversations that he has with his interlocutors are really difficult to conceive of. What exactly would it mean for this thing to be, for anything to be absolutely perfect and universally perfect? For Socrates, the answer has something to do with whether or not it nurtures the soul and whether it orders the soul. Because for Socrates, there can be a perfect alignment of the soul. So that's going to be really important to think through conceptually what that means. This idea of transcendence also includes the idea that the truth, capital T truth, is not the same thing as little t truth. Little t truth are contingent things that are correct in the moment that we use to settle arguments, that we employ in a given situation to resolve conflict or to move through politics. For Socrates, he's not really interested in those things. He wants absolute truth. So he also connects this to the idea that the good is not the same thing as lowercase g good. So we think about this, something that is good. My almost 3-year-old would eat dessert for every meal if we would let her. She says, it's very good. But that wouldn't be good for her. And this theme of self-control and childishness is going to come up over and over in these dialogues. So Socrates has something to say about self-control and self-restraint in relation to the good, and that sort of self-restraint providing a path to capital T truth. be on the lookout for those things. Because Gorgias and his students aren't really concerned with capital T truth, they're concerned with winning an argument. And part of this is because of the political structure in Athens, which we'll also discuss in a minute. So a few quick points. Plato wrote these dialogues, right? And I've referenced this already. That means that Plato is essentially writing a story about his teacher. He wants the teacher to be correct. He is writing these conversations in the way that he wants people to see Socrates, not necessarily the way that people did see Socrates. So Plato's conception of Socrates is largely fictional. All right, so while there is a historical Socrates, or was a historical Socrates, what we're reading is something of an artistic license or a representation, which complicates the philosophical points that Plato is making even further. Other things to keep in mind. Gorgias is wealthy. He's famous. People like Gorgias. Socrates just sort of wanders into his party uninvited and says, I know you guys were having a party. I know you were giving some speeches, but hey, man, do it again. Do it for my edification. The same people that are in this room are eventually going to decide they really don't like Socrates to the extent that they're willing to sentence him to death. Also, think about the fact that with Gorgias being a wealthy person, Socrates is advocating for an ascetic lifestyle. He's kind of like somebody who would be in the monastic tradition. He really doesn't want to talk to a lot of people. He only wants to talk to people in a one-on-one setting if possible. But he doesn't believe in the accumulation of material wealth because he thinks that that is part of the little g good, not a capital G good. So he's going to get into the misplaced priorities and misplaced convictions of the people of Athens, and he's going to blame Gorgias and his students for convincing the people of Athens to pursue the wrong ends or the wrong goals. So the other thing to think about is that one of the things that is certainly true is that though Socrates is the protagonist in these dialogues, our modern conception of rhetoric is really influenced by Gorgias and the sophists as well. So a lot of our modern traditions in terms of politics and discourse are really kind of a blend of both philosophical and rhetorical pursuits. So the agora and public spaces. The agora is where people argued in ancient Athens in terms of this very nascent form of democracy. There weren't many people that were allowed to vote, but you ostensibly had to argue with the people whom were making decisions, the limited number of citizens. And Socrates and Gorgias taught people how to argue in that space. But again, they had very different pedagogical approaches, very different substance, very different style. The setting of Gorgias takes place inside of a private house, right? It's a party hosted by Callicles in Gorgias's honor. It's not the agora. It's not a public space. What are the complications or implications for Socrates having this argument within a private space? Another concept is the demos. The demos means the people or the public. So even though there are only about 15% of the population that are considered citizens and that can speak in the agora, the demos themselves, and we'll see this within the dialogue, conceptualizes themselves as a sort of broader representation of Athens. And the people, there's a question of whether or not politicians should strive to have the people love them or whether they should be doing good for the people and nurturing their soul. At any rate, the people who were able to speak in the agora and represent the demos sought training. So as Socrates goes through and makes these arguments with the various people he's going to argue with, he is attempting to do what we call epideixis in rhetoric, and that's a rhetorical demonstration, a teaching demonstration. If you think of this as a teaching demonstration, he is showing Gorgias that he doesn't know what he's teaching. He is showing that his students are not very well trained, even though people listen to them and are influenced by them when they speak in the agora, and that the progression of the conversation begins to assign blame to Gorgias for the state of affairs in Athens because of the way that he has gone about teaching people how to do stuff or how to convince people of things without actually knowing the essence of what they're arguing about. Which brings us back to the idea of absolute truth in the forms, capital T truth and the forms. So images would be at the lowest end of representation for Socrates, and he goes through and he has this hierarchy of the forms that you see on the slide here. But there is something to consider here. Telos, or a study of the ends, the getting to the ends, is teleology, right? That's the study of it. That would be sort of in a contingent situation. What are your goals? What is the end game of your argument? Well, for Socrates, it's always the pursuit of this highest form of the good, not necessarily the resolution of a situation at hand. So all discussion should lead to revelations that then lead people to the good, the true, and the beautiful. We might want to ask ourselves, what's the nature of the conversations that you have on a regular day or on a regular basis? How many of those conversations do you think are leading you to the good or the true or the beautiful? So we're going to give Socrates the benefit of the doubt as we begin reading these dialogues, which is kind of hard to do because Socrates walks in, basically starts an argument with these folks. He's a gadfly. He's the modern day version, or the modern day version of this would be an internet troll, right? He goes around and he looks for ways to aggravate people. And he's arguing with people about whether or not they're doing a good job of teaching their students when he wants people to teach philosophy and what they are teaching is rhetoric. So they're not really even arguing about whether they teach the same subjects. So rhetoric versus philosophy. Certainly the two things inform one another, and we're not saying that they're diametrically opposed, certainly not as they currently exist. Socrates is setting up this dichotomy, though. He thinks that they are diametrically opposed. And again, as we go through and we look at personal freedom for individuals, as we see in this quotation, Socrates is concerned whether people have mastery over themselves, not whether they have mastery over other people. So what's the difference between doing politics if you're worried about self-control versus the control of others? This is going to tell us a lot about the ways in which early versions of rhetoric and early versions of philosophy were being conceived of in Athens. What kind of responsibility comes when you teach people how to either exhibit self-control? What responsibility do you have? Or if you're teaching people to lead other people and to have them make decisions, what other responsibilities come along with that? Are there ethical concerns when you convince people that they should or should not do a given thing? So, what do we have to know in order to have these discussions? Well, Socrates says that the chief thing that we need to know in any conversation that we have is whether somebody is committing justice or injustice. So we have to know whether something is just in and of itself. We have to know whether the actions of people are just or unjust. If they are just, they are in the pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful. If they are not in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful, they are intrinsically and inherently unjust or a part of injustice. So for Socrates, it's always going to come back to justice. So in addition to the true, the good, and the beautiful, you always have to ask yourself whether something is just or something is not just. Socrates also sees himself in a battle for Athens' soul. So Gorgias is doing his job, right, in terms of training people that pay him to teach them how to speak. Socrates essentially thinks that Gorgias has no moral grounding. It would be akin to the Joker as played in various Batman films, right? Sort of an agent of chaos who's not really tied to an ethical system. Socrates is obviously very critical of this. So think about the implications for this, because by the time you get to the end of the dialogue, which will be sort of, you'll see these repetitions of stasis theory taking place through each series of questioning with each interlocutor. What is it that Socrates is after? He's talking about not only the soul of individual people, but the soul of Athens itself. The method which he uses and the method that he's going to engage folks in here is the dialectic. He doesn't like making speeches. He says making speeches is a bad process because it's monologic. That means one person is speaking. So ostensibly, you could be talking back to the lecture that I'm giving right now, but really this is one-way communication. I'm giving a lecture, whereas in class we have discussions, but Socrates would even question our own method of teaching in the BIC, even though we often say that we follow a Socratic method because we have too many people in the class. He thinks that the best way to teach people is one-on-one conversation and really getting to the essence of what is just and true, and that two people should be engaged in that process. That's not always possible, and it's not always particularly efficient. So keep that in mind as well. Also question why, if Socrates thinks that that is the primary mode or the best mode of teaching, right, that there would be a form, why is Plato writing all this stuff down? Certainly it's not for one person to read, right? It would be for a wider audience to read it. So we're seeing a rhetorical demonstration here, as I said, epideixis, and it's a demonstration of the dialectic. Even as Socrates or Plato's Socrates privileges the dialectic, you're going to see some inconsistencies come up within this. The other thing that you'll notice when you're reading this dialogue is something called definition by negation. And this can be kind of infuriating. You're defining something by what it isn't. So it would be like me telling you, if I needed something out of my car, which parking lots in campus that my car is not parked in, rather than telling you a parking lot where it is parked, telling you which colors my car is not, telling you what kind of car it is not, rather than just telling you what kind of car I drive and where it's located. So this sort of process for Socrates, right, can be kind of infuriating. So you see kind of a list of television shows here, and these are broadly considered some of the best made television shows of the last 20 years. Imagine trying to debate which one of these television shows is the best of the last 20 years of television by saying the things that each show didn't have in them. That's going to be a kind of a discussion where it might be entertaining and it might be a fun intellectual exercise for a while, but after a bit, it's going to become really tiring because you tend to focus on what kinds of things a show or a movie or music has that you do enjoy rather than what it didn't have and why that lessened your enjoyment of it. But again, for Socrates, it's not about enjoyment. It's about reaching a form of something, the absolute form where something is attaining perfection in pursuit of justice. Why does that matter? Well, the enrichment of the soul is achieved through being a just person, according to Socrates. So for Socrates, there is a right question to every answer. There's the right answer. And we know that in everyday life, there are lots of answers that are pretty right or pretty correct for the things that we're trying to get done. So I have this 42 up here because I really enjoy Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And when they put in what is the meaning of life into a computer, it finally spits out an answer after a long time computing 42. For Socrates, there would be a 42. There would be a form. And that the dialectic is the way to get to that form. That's what he's arguing. Does he convince you through this process of argumentation, or does he aggravate you? Does he do both? So possible questions that you may have. Think about these things because they'll help your reading evolve, right? At the beginning, we said that all reading processes are a process of evolving your reading and evolving the way that you read things. That's going to be true. So what are the differences between the definitions of terms offered by Socrates and the people he talks to? What are the differences between temporal, that is to say temporary goods, and transcendent goods? What does it mean for something to be beneficial in the moment, but not beneficial across time in a universal way. That's going to be really important. What ideas do you see in the dialogue that might apply to historical political circumstances in the United States? So what are some of the through lines? If you're going to make a framework and analyze any given set of things, you're not making that framework just for the sake of showing that you read the text. You're creating that framework in order to think about how useful it is to analyze something else. So as you think about creating a framework, as you think about attempting to go through and really make a set of analytical tools out of these Platonic dialogues, start pulling particular quotations from the dialogues that you think would help inform your analysis of some other situation. Thanks.